Miracle in the desert. Ibrahim Traoré turns salt water into Africa's gold. No rivers to quench the soil, no mercy from the clouds. Mothers boil rust-colored rainwater scraped from tin roofs, if it rains at all. Children collapse with empty jerry cans in their hands. Livestock die standing, eyes glazed in the dust. This is not a nightmare. This is Burkina Faso, 2025. And then, madness or miracle. An order came down, bury the water. Not oil, not gold, but clean, purified water, drained into the sand and sealed away. To the thirsty, it looked like cruelty. To the world, it looked like insanity. But to President Ibrahim Traoré, it was war. Because in his eyes, every gallon buried beneath the desert was not lost. It was a weapon. A shield. A declaration. The West shouted, "Reckless!" But the man they tried to dismiss as a soldier out of his depth answered with fire. If we do not act today, our children will die tomorrow. Not because God failed us, but because we failed to prepare. Do not turn away now. This is no ordinary headline. Subscribe and stay with us. For this is the sound of Africa rising through fire, through dust, through water buried like treasure. The year was 2025, and the landlocked nation of Burkina Faso stood at the edge of collapse. Rainfall had become a memory, not a season. The National Meteorological Agency reported less than 740 millimeters of rain that year, the lowest in over a decade. In provinces like Udalan and Tapoa, the figure barely crossed 500 millimeters, far below the threshold needed to keep crops alive. The countryside cracked like a broken mosaic. In the north, villagers dug with bare hands for hours, desperate to find a muddy sip at the bottom of a dying well. In the south, herds of cattle collapsed along riverbeds that no longer carried water, bones jutting out like monuments to hunger. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, mothers collected rainwater in rusted pots when the skies blessed them, and when they did not, they boiled whatever runoff trickled from corrugated rooftops. For the Burkinabe, this was not a temporary drought. It was a slow collapse. The United Nations called the Sahel one of the most climate-vulnerable regions on Earth. But for the farmer who woke to barren soil and empty granaries, that was not a headline. It was breakfast. No water meant no food. No food meant no future. Between 2018 and 2024, more than 1.6 million people were displaced in Burkina Faso. Some fled violence, but many fled thirst. Entire villages in the dry corridor between Kaya and Fadangourma were emptied, their children abandoning school to trek 20 kilometers in search of water. Even the cities, swollen with migration, could not cope. Ouagadougou's treatment plants, dependent on dwindling surface runoff, operated at 30% below demand. The population had nearly doubled in 15 years, but water infrastructure had not kept pace. The result was rationing, unrest, and the rise of a black market where water cost more than bread. By 2025, Burkina Faso, once self-sufficient in millet, sorghum, and maize, relied on grain imports from Ghana, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire. This dependency was more than an inconvenience, it was a geopolitical wound. President Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned head of state, had warned repeatedly, if the rains continue to fail, Burkina Faso risks becoming a permanent humanitarian zone, ruled not by its people, but by aid trucks and foreign contractors. It was against this backdrop that the order came. Bury the water, millions of gallons, purified and treated, sealed beneath the desert sand. The world gasped. Foreign correspondents labeled it reckless. Aid agencies branded it wasteful. And the ordinary farmer in Yatenga asked a question that hung like smoke in the air. Why would any leader hide water when his people are dying of thirst? The answer, according to Traoré, was both simple and radical. He saw water not as a commodity to be consumed, but as a strategic reserve, as vital as gold or uranium. Surface reservoirs evaporated under the burning Sahel sun. Conventional dams lost billions of liters each year. But water buried beneath hydrophobic membranes, layered under engineered dunes, could not be stolen, could not be poisoned, could not be drained by the unforgiving sky. Traoré called it not madness but preparation. His reasoning was harsh yet prophetic. If Burkina Faso remained dependent on rainfall, it would die, not in a single day, but in waves. First the crops, then the livestock, then the people, and finally, hope itself. He called it openly the silent genocide of climate neglect. His officials whispered another term, hydro-exodus, the mass displacement of millions, not by bombs but by dust. To Traore, burying water was not burying hope, it was preserving survival without permission. For generations, Africa had been told to wait for aid, to beg for projects, to survive on the charity of others. But in 2025, this soldier president declared a new doctrine. Water is not charity, it is sovereignty. And so, while villagers clawed the earth with their hands and cattle withered under the sky, steel pipes hissed in the desert. Valves sealed and water disappeared underground, not wasted, not lost, but hidden. In his eyes, it was not an engineering project. It was a war doctrine, drafted not with ink, but with brine. The outside world could not comprehend it. To hide salvation beneath the feet of the dying seemed like cruelty. But for Burkina Faso, it was the first step of a new and dangerous gamble. Because in this nation where every drop is a negotiation, the greatest battle had only just begun. When the decree known as Directive 44B, later called the Sovereign Water Doctrine, was unveiled, confusion turned to outrage. Why bury water, the press demanded, when citizens queued for hours with empty buckets? Why seal salvation underground when children fainted on their way to fetch muddy sips from failing wells? The project was codenamed Silent Reservoir. It was not a single dam, nor a vast lake glistening under the sun. It was an invisible grid of underground bunkers, each filled with desalinated water transported by solar-powered pumps, wrapped in hydrophobic membranes, insulated against evaporation, sabotage, and theft. This water could not be seen by satellites, nor stolen by militias. It was locked away, monitored by an AI system built not in Silicon Valley, but in Ouagadougou, developed by Burkina Faso engineers under 30. To the outside observer, it was reckless, an eccentric gamble by a young president. But to the people who had lived through decades of waiting for aid that never arrived, it was a declaration, never again. Alongside Silent Reservoir, another campaign unfolded, quieter but no less revolutionary. Across provinces from Koudougou to Yatenga, villagers woke to the sound of construction not funded by the IMF or stamped with French contractor logos, but led by their own. Within just 2 years, over 318 micro-dams and retention basins had been built or restored. These modest concrete walls were not grand spectacles. There were no ribbon cuttings or gleaming plaques. Yet each one turned sudden floods into stored lifelines, feeding fields, recharging aquifers, and giving back the possibility of farming beyond the rains. Farmers called it nothing short of resurrection. Fields that had lain barren for a decade now shimmered green. Women's cooperatives planted tomatoes in October, unheard of in living memory. Goat herders no longer walked 30 kilometers for a trough of water. Millet fields rose again, and children who had abandoned classrooms to fetch water returned with books in their hands. The world, however, was less forgiving. In Brussels, officials declared the strategy wasteful. In Geneva, water experts dismissed it as unsustainable. Aid agencies warned that Burkina Faso was burying its future. The United Nations, caught between alarm and admiration, labeled the plan ambitious. The World Bank called it fiscally concerning. But on the ground, the verdict was different. In Kaya, a farmer named Abdoulaye told reporters, "For years we begged for rain. Now, for the first time, we have water when the sky refuses us." In Bobo Dioulasso, a mother of 4 said, "It feels like a miracle." But it is not a miracle. It is our own children who built this. And then came the words that electrified both his supporters and his critics. In a national address, President Ibrahim Traoré declared, "Water is not for charity. Water is for sovereignty, and sovereignty is not asked for. It is taken." His cabinet trembled. International donors froze their checks, but in the villages, in the markets, in the mosques, the phrase spread like wildfire. It was no longer about survival. It was about dignity. For decades, Africa had been told to wait for rain, for loans, for contractors, for permission. But in 2025, Burkina Faso broke the script. The young engineers who designed solar microgrids in Ouagadougou became local heroes. Teachers recited the specifications of water catchments as if they were scripture. Elders, who had watched generations leave for distant cities, now saw a reason for their grandchildren to stay. And yet, with every drop sealed underground, a darker question began to rise. Who would control the valves? Would access to buried water remain with the people, or would it become another tool of state power? Could sovereignty over water protect the nation, or divide it even further? The answer was not yet clear. But one thing was certain. The battle over water in Burkina Faso was no longer a local struggle. It had become a global conversation, and the stakes were rising with every gallon hidden beneath the sand. The impact of the water doctrine did not remain buried in the desert. It rose above the sand into villages, markets, and even parliaments. Ordinary Burkinabe who had long lived with resignation began to witness changes they could touch, taste, and trust. In Koudougou, a woman named Mariam poured clean water into a clay pot without walking miles to fetch it. Her cooperative had revived, planting tomatoes and onions even in the dry season. In Yatenga, goat herders who once traveled 30 kilometers to find a trough now watered their flocks in their own villages. School attendance, long crippled by the burden of children fetching water, began to climb again. For the first time in years, parents dared to believe their sons and daughters might inherit not just survival, but opportunity. This transformation went beyond agriculture. Micro dams and retention basins reduced the destruction of flash floods, sparing villages from devastation. Wells replenished, aquifers stabilized, and local food security strengthened. Villagers spoke of dignity restored. No longer waiting for sacks of grain from aid convoys, they began to grow their own again. Yet with renewal came politics. Traore's doctrine did not only restore fields, it rewrote power. In Ouagadougou, the phrase "water is sovereignty" was etched into public speeches, repeated in classrooms, whispered in marketplaces. The doctrine hardened into law. Water, once managed piecemeal, became declared a state-protected asset alongside uranium and gold. But the question of control soon loomed large. Who would decide when and how the underground reservoirs were tapped? Would access be free and communal, or tightly regulated by the state? Some villagers celebrated the new order. Others feared centralization could turn water into a political weapon. Rumors spread of elites gaining easier access, of regional governors influencing distribution. The stakes were too high for apathy. In a nation where every drop meant life or death, governance of water meant governance of survival itself. And as Burkina Faso shifted from dependence on rain to engineered reserves, it also shifted the balance of power. Traditional chiefs found themselves negotiating with engineers. Local councils argued with national ministries. Sovereignty was no longer abstract, it flowed or failed to flow through pipes. This was not only a Burkinabe story. Across Africa, scholars and leaders began to take notice. Newspapers in Dakar and Nairobi called it the birth of an Africa water sovereignty revolution. For the first time, a government had treated water not as aid, not as a temporary fix, but as the foundation of independence. Young African engineers studied the Burkinabe model, asking if their nations too could dig, catch, and store life against the betrayal of the skies. But revolutions are not without costs. Burkina Faso's radical approach unsettled old alliances. International donors, sidelined by homegrown solutions, grew skeptical. Some withdrew funding. NGOs complained of being excluded. At the same time, domestic critics warned that hiding water might sow distrust. How do we know it is really there? Who decides when it comes out? And then there was the danger of envy. Communities spared by microdams looked across at neighboring villages still thirsty. Farmers who gained irrigation felt resentment from those who remained dependent on failing wells. Every new basin or pipeline was not just an engineering project. It was a territorial claim, a political decision, a line in the sand. The results, however, could not be ignored. Reports from the National Water Agency in mid-2025 showed agricultural yields doubling in some provinces within a single cycle. Local economies stirred. Markets bustled. Women organized cooperatives around new irrigation schemes. Children returned to schools once emptied. Hope flickered, not as charity, but as something earned. Still, hope is fragile. With water now classified as a strategic resource, Burkina Faso faced a profound dilemma. Could sovereignty over water be shared with its people without corruption, inequality, or repression? Would this doctrine build unity or fracture trust? Traore himself framed the struggle in stark terms. If we do not own our water, we own nothing. To him, water was the front line of a larger battle, not only for food security, but for political independence, dignity, and African pride. Yet even as fields turned green and villages revived, one truth lingered like a shadow. What happens when those who thirst realize that salvation lies sealed just beneath their feet and not in their hands? Burkina Faso's defiance could not remain a domestic affair. By mid-2025, its silent reservoirs and micro-dams had already stirred controversy in the halls of power thousands of miles away. For decades, the Sahel had been painted as a zone of humanitarian dependency, a theater where aid agencies, NGOs, and foreign governments performed the ritual of charity. Suddenly, one of the region's poorest nations had turned the script upside down. In Brussels, policymakers scoffed. To them, water was a commodity, to be financed, traded, and managed through global markets. The idea of burying it underground outside of donor oversight looked like waste. In Geneva, aid officials complained that Burkina Faso was locking up resources that should be shared through international coordination. The World Bank issued reports labeling the strategy fiscally concerning, warning that a poor state could not afford such extravagance without endangering its fragile budget. But while Western donors raised their brows, the Global South took notice. Engineers from India and Algeria, nations with decades of desert water expertise, arrived to lend their hands. African Development Bank bonds funded solar grids to power new desalination corridors. And in April 2025, an unprecedented moment shook the region. Burkina Faso, landlocked and long dismissed as powerless, signed treaties with Guinea and Côte d'Ivoire, granting permanent access to the Atlantic, not for trade, but for water. Pipelines stretching hundreds of kilometers began drawing seawater inland. In Benora, near the Ivorian border, a high-pressure reverse osmosis plant was inaugurated, the first of its kind for Burkina Faso. Capable of transforming 100,000 gallons of seawater per day into drinkable, mineral-balanced fresh water, it stood as a symbol of the unthinkable, that geography itself could be rewritten. International observers scrambled. The United Nations called it ambitious. Some Western think tanks called it reckless. But in Dano, Gawa, and Leo, people called it something simpler, a miracle. Mothers who had buried children during drought now filled their pots with clean water in the middle of the dry season. For the United States, the development was a puzzle. Washington had long framed the Sahel through the lens of counterterrorism and security. Water in their playbook was humanitarian aid, a bandage, not a weapon of sovereignty. Traoré's defiance shifted the paradigm. Here was a young leader declaring that survival would no longer be dictated by donors or IMF contracts, but by sovereign will. Whether admired or feared, the doctrine forced even American strategists to ask, what happens when Africa starts solving problems on its own terms? Burkina Faso had not only built underground reservoirs, it had built a precedent. Across West Africa, young leaders whispered about a Burkina Faso economy breakthrough 2025, a model of independence rooted not in external loans, but in the control of life's most fundamental resource. And yet behind the applause and criticism, one reality remained. Revolutions, especially those that defy global powers, never go unnoticed for long. Burkina Faso's gamble had altered more than its parched soil, it had altered imagination itself. For decades, Africans were told that climate was destiny, that drought would forever chain the Sahel to famine and dependency. But in 2025, a small, landlocked nation declared otherwise. Through buried reservoirs, desalination pipelines, and grassroots dams, it proved that defiance could be engineered into policy. Yet the road ahead is no gentle slope. The risks are immense. Every drop hidden underground raises questions of control and fairness. Could centralized management of water ignite new rivalries between provinces? Might powerful elites seize control of valves, turning sovereignty into another hierarchy? Envy, too, remains a threat. Communities benefiting from microdams already face tension with neighbors still left thirsty. Water, once a universal struggle, now risks becoming a source of political division. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, pressure mounts. Donors who lost influence may seek ways to undermine the doctrine. Corporations see opportunity in scarcity and may attempt to monetize access. And neighboring nations, some already eyeing their own aquifers, might not applaud forever. As water becomes the world's most contested resource, what begins as innovation could just as easily become provocation. But there is another path, one of opportunity. Burkina Faso's model demonstrates that sovereignty is not a metaphor. It can be measured in pipes buried beneath the sand, in dams holding back floods, in desalination plants humming far from the sea. If scaled across the Sahel, this doctrine could transform famine corridors into breadbaskets. If embraced by African leaders, it could turn dependency into self-reliance, aid zones into zones of production. This is the lesson Traore's government has offered. Africa cannot wait for clouds. It must engineer its own rain. It must store its future beneath its own feet, not in the vaults of foreign donors. And for elders who once prayed under dry skies, this vision is not abstract. It is the fulfillment of a generational hope that their grandchildren might inherit a land not cursed by the climate, but blessed by courage. The road ahead demands unity. If African states stand divided, water may become a wedge. But if they stand together, water can become a flag. Already, students across West Africa are studying Burkina Faso's systems as models, not miracles. Already, farmers are asking, if they can do it, why can't we? The choice is clear, but it is not simple. Will Africa guard its buried rivers as a shield of dignity, or will it fracture under the weight of envy and pressure? Will sovereignty flow freely, or will it be dammed by politics and greed? Burkina Faso's story in 2025 is not merely about water. It is about the audacity to act when the world expected silence. It is about a landlocked nation, battered by drought and dismissed as fragile, daring to engineer survival into sovereignty. From buried reservoirs to invisible rivers, from micro-dams to treaties that defied geography, President Ibrahim Traoré declared what few dared to say aloud: water is not charity, it is sovereignty. For his critics, this was reckless, a dangerous gamble in a fragile economy. For his people, it was prophetic, a turning point in which desperation was transformed into dignity. And for Africa, it may be something even larger. The first chapter in an Africa water sovereignty revolution, where resources are no longer begged for, but owned, protected, and multiplied by African hands. The harvests rising again in Yatenga, the children returning to classrooms in Kaya, the mothers drawing water in Leo without fear of tomorrow, these are not miracles. They are the fruits of policy, the evidence that courage can be measured not only in slogans, but in leaders' pipelines and solar grids. They are proof that Burkina Faso Economy Breakthrough 2025 is not a headline, it is a lived reality. But revolutions do not end in 1 year nor with one leader. The deeper question remains. Will Africa seize this doctrine as a continental shield, or let it wither under division, envy, and external pressure? Will sovereignty flow like a buried river across the Sahel, or will it remain trapped beneath the sands of one small nation? The answer lies not only with presidents or engineers, but with people, with you, with us, with those who refuse to accept the script of dependency any longer. This is the inheritance our ancestors prayed for, that one day Africa would not wait for the clouds, nor bow to the donor's hand, but rise on its own terms. If this story stirs something deep in your chest, do not let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe, because our history was silenced too long, and our future must be spoken out loud. Say it in the comments if you believe New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it. This is not the end. It is the dawn of the Africa water sovereignty revolution.